I'm Parth and I have Suhas with me, and we represent the product folks. I see a lot of regular names, but for those who don't know about the product folks, we are a community of professionals, product managers, product designers, marketers who are very passionate about the product space overall. We are a 15K strong community across the globe. We have multiple chapters. Apart from these regular events that you keep attending with us, we have a bunch of other offerings. These offerings start with a content curated platform where if you want to upskill your product management skills, it's called Learn PM with me. Apart from that content curation, we also run boot camps, an APM boot camp called Insurger.club. It's an interesting space for those who are aspiring PMs and who would want to go into this space much deeper through a training process. And lastly, as a community, we connect professionals as an e-connect professionals with a product called grabchai.online. It's a very interesting product. Every weekend you would receive an invite if you sign up. And yeah, just a quick run through on the agenda today. We'll have a quick intro about Ravi who's joined us today. First for like 5 minutes. And then Ravi would take over his deck on product decision making that would span around 40 minutes. Then at the end, we would have a quick Q&A for like 20 minutes with all your questions curated and some that we already have. So over to Suhas for the intro.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks so much, Parth. And hi, Ravi. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Awesome. So guys, like Parth mentioned, I think a bunch of initiatives and all this is volunteer driven. So at any point of time, you guys want to join in, feel free to DM us. Now wasting any other time, jumping right into Ravi's intro, who's our speaker today. Ravi recently joined as an EIR with Reforge. He's had multiple, most recently, he was also the Chief Product Officer at Tinder, but he's held like senior leadership roles at Facebook, TripAdvisor, Xbox. So on today's session, I think we have a lot of anecdotes, a lot of insights from his journey. We have a couple of interesting questions as well, which you guys can definitely like add on to. I'll share the link. And yeah, with that, over to you, Ravi. I think next 30 minutes is yours, and we'll see you towards the end of the session.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm excited to hear everyone's questions and get to know everyone. So let me pull up my screen. Give me 1 sec. Great. Is it looking good?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Awesome. So today I'm going to talk through Zen and the Art of Product, which is the 3 pillars of product decision making. So throughout my career, I've noticed this pattern that product managers have multiple different types of things to draw from. So they can draw decisions from their own intuition. They can draw from analytics. They can draw from the feedback that they're hearing from users. But over and over again throughout my career, I've seen that product teams tend to bias towards one type of decision making over the other 2. And as a result, that can lead to wrong decisions that can lead to a product that eventually gets disrupted. And so I pulled together examples, not just from my experience, but from across the tech industry to illustrate really good, balanced decision-making and illustrate examples of when decision-making went wrong and how that might have been improved. I'll also talk about why it's so hard for product managers to consistently make decisions using all 3 of these different pillars and why people, teams, companies tend to bias towards one type of decision making. So I have been in product my entire career. I actually got into technology when I was really young. My dad brought home a computer when I was 9 years old. And back then there wasn't much to do on the computer other than to learn how to program. So from a young age, I learned how to program. I learned BASIC and assembly language. This was back in the day before a lot of the fancy languages that we have today. And I started making games, and at that point I fell in love with technology. I started making games and distributing them online, getting some feedback, and that was sort of my first experience with an entrepreneurial journey. And so all through high school and college, I continued to make games. I dropped out of college for a little bit to do that full time, then went back and finished up my degree. right after school, I had an opportunity to work at Microsoft, and I joined Microsoft right as the company was making a really large investment in the gaming space, and it turned out that that investment was Xbox. So I joined as one of the first 20 or so people on the Xbox team. I spent a lot of time thinking about Xbox Live, both in terms of what the platform should do, as well as in terms of where online gaming was going from a content perspective. I was there for about 6 years. I've also had consumer product leadership experience at TripAdvisor. I joined TripAdvisor at a really interesting time when the company was scaling very quickly. So I had an opportunity to build up a really strong product team and also really shift the product from a very review-driven product to a much more transactional product. About 3 years ago, I joined Facebook, where I managed a team focused on youth engagement. So we're specifically trying to understand, why do teens use social media, and why were those patterns and behaviors changing over time, and what could Facebook do about that? And then about a year and a half ago, I joined Tinder as the chief product officer, with really two goals. One is to really think about where social discovery and dating is going for Gen Z, as well as to help level up the product organization. It was a product organization that had grown very quickly because the product had caught product market fit so quickly. But we did a lot of thinking about how to put in place the processes, the career ladders, the decision-making methodologies necessary to run a product team at scale. And then most recently, so this week, actually, I started as an executive in residence at Reforge. I'm going to be teaching a class on product strategy in the fall. I'm really excited about it. It's a course that Reforge created in response to feedback, which was, there's a lot of great coursework for product managers that are newer, but for PMs that are transitioning from product managers to product leaders, there's not as much material about how to navigate that transition and how the role really changes when you move from a PM to a product leader. So I've really loved product. I really love consumer. I'm passionate about making things that impact people's lives. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today comes from the things that I've learned as part of that. Great. So ultimately, when you're making great products, it's about making great decisions. And great decisions are decisions that deliver impact. They're decisions that deliver impact for your customers, for your company, for your team. And so ultimately, I believe that product managers need to measure themselves not based on the features that they ship, but based on the impact that they make to those three really important stakeholders. The most important, of course, is customers. And then also, as you build value for customers, you want to build value for your company as well. And so if we look at how product managers make decisions, give me one sec, I'm just going to change something. Okay, never mind. The best product decisions get made by striking a balance between three things: intuition, analytics, and feedback. Most product managers have a bias towards one type of decision making. There are some product managers that really draw on their intuition, and in many ways, they are product designers. They look at the world around them, synthesize that into a perspective on what the right product is, and build that product. But if you take that too far, then you design something without really understanding how that product fits into the world. There's product managers that are really analytical, and this is very much in fashion nowadays. They're great at running experiments. They're great at getting data. They're great at making decisions based on the data. And those product managers are really product scientists. They are looking at their customers from an experimental standpoint, learning from experiments how those customers behave, and making decisions based on the hypotheses or the behaviors that they observe. And in those cases, those product managers can be very effective, especially in growing a product that already has product market fit. But oftentimes, analytics alone is not enough to really understand deeply what customers want and come up with something that truly meets their needs and is different from what came before it. And finally, there are product managers who really love talking to customers, and these operate in a mode of being a product researcher. And so they understand customers very well, but product researchers run the risk of over-indexing on what customers say and not being able to synthesize all the inputs into a solution that customers would never be able to talk about because they don't know that it exists yet. And as I mentioned, product managers have a really hard time striking a balance between these three things. I think naturally, based on personality, PMs tend to bias towards one type of decision-making or another. Company cultures tend to incentivize one type of decision-making more than another. Today, analytics is held in really high regard. And so a lot of companies really push on the analytics and the product scientist mode of thinking. But ultimately, being able to strike the balance is the ingredient to making really good product decisions that are both result in short-term impact as well as long-term value creation. So the first mode of decision-making is intuition. Intuition is a sensibility about what makes a product great for a customer. At its best, intuition leads to breakthrough products that disrupt markets. I'm going to talk about an example of that. Intuitive decision-making is often institutionalized into a company culture, but it can also come from a PM that just has a great intuition about what products customers want and do a great job with synthesizing all of the inputs that they're getting into a strong set of intuition. Many of the most successful products start with an intuitive insight, oftentimes because entrepreneurs in the early days don't have any data to base decisions on. Google began with the insight that the quantity of information that was being continually created on the internet was going to increase, and it was going to increase exponentially, and that the way of accessing information needed to change from a directory orientation. So Yahoo had a directory of all the pages. They were manually curating everything out on the internet, to much more of a search orientation, where people needed a convenient keyword-based way of accessing the information that they needed. So that intuitive insight about what customers needed and where the technology was going drove a really significant product that's created value for decades. So I want to talk through one of the other examples of great intuitive thinking. So it's hard to remember now, but Steve Jobs actually got fired from Apple. So Apple went through a really hard period where the company nearly went bankrupt. In fact, Microsoft had to come in and make an investment in Apple. They made a $400 million investment in Apple to keep the company solvent. And during that time, Apple had really lost its way. Steve Jobs came back through the acquisition of Next. So he had gone and built a really interesting technology that didn't have the same sort of consumer scale as Apple, but solved a lot of really important technology problems for where Apple was going. And when he came back, he started to think, what is the thing that Apple should be doing to really put itself back at the forefront of technology? What would be the next great Apple product? And Steve had always loved music. He had been a fan of music throughout his life. He was really concerned about the awkward state of the market. The market, especially in these early days of MP3 players, was littered with awkward devices. They were slow. They were hard to use. They were ill-conceived. And Steve Jobs really started to think, how can Apple create a better music experience? And so that eventually led to the iPod. And so the iPod was a radically simpler device than the devices that were out in the market at the time. But it wasn't a simple device. Apple had incredibly deep knowledge and capabilities around hardware design. And they mustered all of those capabilities to create a device that was simpler and that perfectly met the needs that Steve Jobs intuitively felt that customers had. So it had more capacity so that you could carry 1,000 songs with you. It had a longer battery so that you could listen to those songs all day long. It was quicker to load so that as you acquired more music, you could get that music onto the device more easily. And ultimately, that combination of things really changed how people were using MP3 players. MP3 players moved from a music listening device into a constant companion that you would have with you. And the iPod changed the face of digital music. It changed the face of Apple. It turned Apple into the rocket ship that we know today. In 2002, when Apple was released the iPod, the company was valued at $10 billion, which is already a very significant valuation. But the valuation of Apple has increased more than 100 times since then, largely driven by this initial insight of devices moving from electronics into digital companions. So let's take a closer look at what Steve Jobs' intuition is. But before we do that, I want to talk about something that's really important about intuition. Oftentimes, the most valuable intuition runs counter to prevailing thinking. Intuitive insights are the most valuable when everyone else is in the dark. Peter Thiel refers to this as knowing a secret. Great entrepreneurs that build enduring companies know a secret before someone else about human behavior and about the things that people really need. And by building based on that knowledge of a secret, they can create companies that are incredibly valuable. And this was the case with Apple. So there were a lot of naysayers when Apple announced the iPod. One critic said, all that hype for an MP3 player, breakthrough digital device, the reality distortion field is starting to warp Steve's mind if he thinks for 1 second that this thing is going to take off. And so let's take a closer look at Apple's intuition. The promise of the iPod was 1,000 songs in your pocket. And the idea behind that would change how people interface with music, how people think about music in their lives. And that would lead to something important as well. If a person had a device that they were going to have with them all the time, that they'd be willing to pay a premium for that device because it's playing such an important part in your life. And that matched really nicely with the existing premium positioning that Apple had created. And so the other thing that enabled Apple to do is by charging higher prices, they would have more capital that they could then invest into research and development that they could then use to create ever more powerful, smaller, simpler, more streamlined devices. And so Apple's intuition was that the iPod would be a beachhead into a much larger market, a much larger future market of companion devices and services. And so the iPod really started Apple's transformation from a computer brand to a lifestyle brand. And some years after Apple released the iPod, they actually officially changed the name from Apple Computer to just Apple to reflect that new positioning in the market. So good intuition builds great companies. It's often the secret behind a company that is able to make a disruptive impact. But bad intuition can be really destructive. Let's take a look at an example of that. So one of Snapchat's biggest strengths is Evan's intuition about young people and what they need from social media. It was the thing that ultimately helped Snapchat become one of the most valuable, one of the most used products in the world. Their intuition about ephemerality, about messaging, about visual communication, led to Snapchat's success. And so Evan and the company went confidently into their next intuitive insight, which was one of the complaints, and this is a quote from Evan, one of the complaints that we've heard about social media is that photos and videos from your friends are mixed in with content from publishers and creators and influencers. Your friends aren't content, they're relationships. That's why today we're separating the social from the media. And so in 2017, Snapchat launched a redesigned app that made good on this promise of separating social from the media. And they fundamentally changed customers' interface into the application. But this intuitive insight turned out to not be the way in which customers wanted to use the Snapchat experience. And ultimately, Snapchat would pay for its over-reliance on intuition instead of using a more balanced approach to decision-making. Snapchat's stock dropped over 40% in the 12 months following the Snapchat redesign. So Snapchat launched the redesign in November 2017. Very quickly, discontent with the redesign started to surface. It was visible in their own internal metrics. It was visible in conversations that they were having with customers, and it was visible in the very public outcry about the redesign from key influencers. In February, Kylie Jenner tweeted, "So does anyone else not open Snapchat anymore?" And this reflected broader sentiments about the frustration with Snapchat. This was also a time when Instagram was really starting to scale stories. And so people flocked to Instagram because they were really not getting what they needed from Snapchat. And it took 5 months before Snapchat eventually started to roll out updates to the redesign. And so we're going to talk in a few moments about a similar situation that Facebook had, where they redesigned something and they also got a backlash. But the end outcome of that backlash was very different for Facebook than it was for Snap. And so over the course of that 5 months, there was a lot of pushback, a lot of negative reaction to the redesign. This was something the company knew about. This was something the press was talking about. There were headlines. It was cataclysmic. Snapchat survived its redesign. Snapchat's redesign cost it millions of users. Evan admits the app was redesigned too quickly. And so this over-reliance on intuition, over-reliance on using just the inputs available within the company, not looking outside to what customers are saying, to what the press is saying, to what you can see in the analytics, is an example of how an over-index on intuitive decision-making can result in the wrong decision. But in this case, it had a happy ending. So this was a great learning opportunity for Snapchat. Snapchat formed a more analytically driven growth team after the redesign. They started to take a more balanced approach to decision-making. They started to really listen more quickly to what customers were saying. And in the time between the redesign and today, Snapchat's value has increased by over 4 times. And so Snapchat learned, like the rest of Silicon Valley has learned, that analytical-based decision-making is incredibly important to making sure that you're creating products that are as optimized as possible for the customers, and as a result can continue to grow at the rate companies want them to grow. So let's look at why analytics are so important. So analytical decisions are based on the insights that come from the analytics that are generated as customers use the product. This is an important distinction between insights and data. Analytics is not just a matter of reporting on the data available to people in the organization or available to product managers. It's really a matter of looking deeply at that data and drawing insight from it and making inferences from the data about why customers are behaving the way that they do. Analytical decision-making leads to incredibly crisp insights that have a causal relationship. And so ultimately, analytical decision-making enables products and companies to realize their maximum potential. The mode of decision-making is in fashion right now because companies are able to drive such continuous improvement from analytical decisions, and because the analytical decisions are more objective than more subjective aspects of decision-making, like intuition or interpreting research. Facebook in particular is a good example of analytical decision-making at its best. Facebook was able to extend its initial product market fit from a small set of colleges to 2 billion people around the world, largely driven by the fact that they have consistently used analytical decision-making to understand where the product is working and where the product isn't working. And when they see areas where the product is working, they do everything they possibly can to extend that use case to as many users as possible. And in that process, make the product more valuable to as many users as possible. So let's look at an example of that in action. So it's hard to remember now, but once upon a time, Facebook was not that different than MySpace. It was a disconnected directory of profiles. And in 2006, Facebook introduced one of the most fundamentally important innovations in social media. That was adding in the newsfeed. And the way in which Facebook came to the insight that adding a newsfeed would be a product that has product market fit was by looking at the analytics, and that they were able to see that when people logged into Facebook, people were moving from profile to profile to profile to really check with their closest friends what had changed since the last time they logged in. And they also noticed that the people who did this behavior were better retained than people who just logged in and used Facebook to just see a couple of profiles and not go from profile to profile to profile. And so both intuitively and analytically, Facebook felt like by adding a newsfeed of all the things that have changed about your friends in the time since you last logged in, that this would be a feature that had incredible market fit and would be something that would increase retention. So they were confident that they had a big win on their hands. What came next for Facebook once they launched newsfeed was really surprising. So Ruchi Sangvi, the product manager for newsfeed, recollected, we woke up to hundreds of thousands of outraged people. Facebook groups like I Hate Newsfeed, Ruchi is the Devil had formed in the middle of the night. News reporters and students were camped out in front of Facebook's offices. We had to sneak out the back door to leave the office. So the negative reaction to newsfeed was swift, was extreme, was something the company saw right away. There was one group that had grown to 284,000 users overnight in under 24 hours. In one form or another, 10% of Facebook's 8 million users at the time had threatened to boycott the company. This was one of the fastest and most viral backlashes to a product in history. And so while a vocal minority complained, Facebook saw something that was really interesting. Ruchi goes on to recollect, amidst all the chaos, all the outrage, we noticed something unusual. Even though everyone claimed they hated it, engagement had doubled. So the reason that the reason that engagement had doubled in this case was actually due to newsfeed. News of newsfeed spread, and the reaction to newsfeed had spread so quickly precisely because newsfeed existed. And one of the things that Facebook did is by looking very diligently, very quickly at the analytics, was they could see that despite all of this reaction, that people were behaving differently, that people were more engaged with Facebook, not less engaged with Facebook as a result of newsfeed. And so Facebook decided that they wouldn't get rid of newsfeed. In fact, that newsfeed would become a key pivotal part of the product. And the reason they were able to do this was because of Facebook's analytical mindset. Facebook uses data to inform its intuition about what people want. They then take that combination of an intuitive insight and an analytical insight and talking to customers, and they productize those existing behaviors into Facebook's product strategy. And as a result, they're able to get a much better hit rate with the products that they ship. And with those products, they're able to grow them more because they're underpinned by that analytical insight. And so Facebook let data, not the vocal minority, determine what to do in response to the Facebook or the newsfeed backlash. The other thing that was really important was not just that Facebook looks at data, but that Facebook looks at data quickly. Real-time analysis supported the decision to keep newsfeed and gave Mark the confidence to make that decision. It also gave Mark the opportunity to address people's concerns in a very clear and thoughtful way, and do it not 5 months later, but do it the same day. And so by Mark posting the same day that they were going to continue to keep newsfeed, that it was generating some really good user engagement, and that it was an important part of where Facebook was going, and do that so quickly after the backlash, they were able to quell that backlash and really go confidently into the future for Facebook, which was a newsfeed-based future. And so analytics can be incredibly powerful. It can blaze a path to a product achieving its maximum potential, but over-reliance on analytics can result in incrementality. And so just as over-reliance on intuition can result in challenges for product managers, so can over-reliance on analytics. So let's take look at an example of where an over-reliance on analytics actually led a company to grow less quickly than they could have had they taken a more balanced approach to decision-making. So HomeAway, which was acquired by Expedia, really touted its scientific mindset. HomeAway leveraged its scientific mindset to become an 800-pound gorilla in the vacation rental market. From HomeAway's IPO in 2011, it consistently grew at 30% over and over again. And it did that through a really deep scientific analytical understanding of what was happening in its product. And so as a result of taking that scientific mindset, they were able to very crisply understand the levers to grow. And so this is something that you'll see in a lot of travel companies. You'll see it at Booking, you'll see it at TripAdvisor. It's important for these companies to take a scientific mindset because they're operating in a very competitive market. And so as a result of this, they were able to drive consistent growth. They were able to drive consistent value creation. And this led to increases in the number of bookable listings, which was a key signal for HomeAway's success. But at the same time that they were driving consistent, strong, incremental growth in their business, there was another business, Airbnb, that was thinking about the problem differently. They were thinking about it definitely from a scientific standpoint, but they were also thinking about it from an intuitive and a customer-driven standpoint. And Airbnb looked at the vacation rental market and they reframed it. They said the vacation rental market is not a sort of cold transaction between a guest and a business. It's actually an interaction between two people, between a host and a guest. And if we reframe that interaction in that way, if we add that more human component to the vacation rental process, we can get people to think differently about vacation rentals and actually change the market, grow the market, because people are looking at it less as a transaction and more as an interaction. And so that combination of an intuitive insight and really understanding deeply at a human level what people want and what they don't want when they're staying in someone else's home, they were able to create a product that was able to grow even more quickly than HomeAway. They were able to get that consistent, incremental, analytically driven growth combined with a more disruptive, intuitive driven growth. And as a result, today, Airbnb is worth over 10 times what HomeAway was worth at the time it was acquired by Expedia. And so one of the things that Airbnb does incredibly well is they have great intuitive insight. They have a great analytical way of making decisions, but they also think about talking to customers in a very deep, very rich way. And so that leads us to our third pillar of product decision-making, which is feedback-based decision-making. Feedback-based decisions are based on qualitative and quantitative research of existing and potential customers. At its best, feedback-based decision-making fosters empathy and uncovers the heart of what customers really want. And this comes back to a quote from Albert Einstein, which I think is more important than ever for product managers operating within this kind of Silicon Valley, very analytics-driven ethos. Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And so the thing that's really important here is to understand that underlying all of the analytics are real people. There's real human behavior. And this human behavior, the needs, the wants that people have are not so easy to quantify. And ultimately, building a great product is not just looking about how people behave within the product, but also really empathizing with those people and understand why they're using the product, what they're trying to solve for with the product, how that product fits into the rest of their lives, and using that deep research-driven insight, that very empathetic insight to create something that's an even better fit for the value that they want to create in their lives. And that is something that Airbnb is particularly good at. Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, commented, if you're only doing A/B tests, you are not designing with empathy. We didn't just meet our users, we lived with them. And so early on in Airbnb's evolution, Brian and his co-founders and the rest of the team, they would go stay in Airbnbs. They would talk to the host. They would talk to the guests. They would go, Airbnb was famous for the photos of the different Airbnbs that were available to potential guests that let them see in living color what a particular place would be like. They would go and take those photos themselves and have conversations with hosts when they were taking those photos. And that early insight into what it was like to be a host, what it was like to be a guest, some of the trust and safety concerns, some of the impact that making a little bit of extra money could have on people's lives, allowed them to build a product that was successful in reframing this interaction between two people as a human social interaction rather than as simply a business transaction. And so Brian reframes building good products into two phases. The first is capturing something magical for a user and doing that at a very artisanal level at a way that doesn't scale. If you can create a really magical experience for a user, then you can understand very deeply what are the components of that magical experience. And then the second phase of creating a business is to figure out what elements of that magical experience you can scale into a business that can meet the needs of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. So this two-phased approach of both creating a magical experience, firstly, and then secondly, scaling a magical experience is something that Airbnb has done over and over again. And one of the thought models that they use to really capture the magical experience is they ask themselves, not what would a 5-star experience look like? So not what would the best experience look like, but what would an 11-star experience look like? How do we go beyond the best into something that feels magical? And as part of feeling magical, it will be infeasible, but that magical thinking will help you understand how to delight customers way past what sort of the prevailing wisdom is about what a best-in-class product is like. And so we can do this by just looking at the Airbnb check-in experience. Let's walk through kind of the thinking behind an 11-star experience for check-in versus a 5-star experience or a 1-star experience. So the 1-star experience is really repulsive. It's something that if a person experienced, they'll never use your product again. An 11-star experience is magical. It's something that once they experience, they're going to want to tell all their friends about. They're going to wait with anticipation for the next time that they can experience it. So for Airbnb check-in, the 1-star experience is the host never shows up. You're stuck on the street. You got to go find alternative accommodation. The 5-star experience is easy to find. As soon as you get to your Airbnb, the host lets you in when you arrive. All of that works smoothly. It's as good as a hotel experience. It's great. There's nothing more the customer could ask for. But what's really interesting is what is starting to ask, what could you do that's even better than that best experience? And so, a 6-star experience might be the host lets you in and presents you with a welcome gift and shows you a fridge that's stocked with water. A 7-star experience might be that they show you a fridge stocked with all your favorite snacks, and the host offers you the key to his car and says, hey, why don't you take my car while you're going around the city? I want you to have as good a time as possible. And the 11-star experience is you get the same welcome as the Beatles did in 1964. You land to 5,000 screaming fans as you get off the plane. There's a red carpet. There's people taking photos. There's someone coming to welcome you. And so it's entirely magical. It's something that would make a person feel like a star. It's not something that's achievable, but it helps you understand what are the motivations that a person has when they check in, which is not just to get into their room, but really to be welcomed into a place that they're exploring for the first time. And so Airbnb used this process, and in a podcast sorry, I'm blanking on the name right now. Sorry, I can't see my notes, but on a podcast, I think it's Masters of Scale. It's by Reid Hoffman. It's the first episode of the podcast. Brian actually talks about putting this process into place. And one of the things that they were doing was they were starting to think about, they wanted to create a trips product that would provide end-to-end trip planning for customers. And to do that, what they decided to do was to create an absolutely magical trip for a single traveler and understand from that process, what are the things that are really important about that magical trip. And so they did two things. One, they followed a traveler on a trip that they had planned to San Francisco. This was a solo trip that they were taking. And from that trip, they learned that the person's trip was definitely entertaining. It was relaxing in parts, but it was nowhere near as fulfilling as it could be. And so they then took that same traveler and they said, hey, why don't we create a trip for you? We're going to handcraft the best possible experience that we can think of. And one of the ways that they did this was they actually worked with a Hollywood script team to write a story of a magical trip from start to finish with that particular traveler. His name was Ricardo, basically starring as the hero in that story. And from there, they scripted out this perfect trip. They had a private limo pick that person up from the airport. And that was much better than having to hail a cab. Ricardo got to stay at a top-rated Airbnb, which was much better than staying at a budget hotel. They got Ricardo reservations at a top San Francisco restaurant, which was much better than visiting a local touristy restaurant. They had Ricardo attend a private cocktail party after dinner, which was much better than sitting alone at a nearby bar. And the crowning point of the trip was a midnight mystery bike tour where Ricardo got to meet tons of people and bike around in the middle of the night San Francisco, which was much better than a solo trip to a sort of touristy attraction in this case, which was Alcatraz. And so in the process of creating this magical experience for Ricardo, they were able to see what were the elements of the trip that really resonated for him. And afterwards, Ricardo actually thanked Brian in tears and said, you know, this is one of the most fulfilling things in my life. I'm going to remember it over and over again. Thank you so much for creating this experience for me. And then they knew that was the type of experience that they needed to make sure that they were doing the best possible job creating within their trip product. And so feedback is really an essential part of understanding customers, but feedback must be used with judgment. Poor use of feedback can lead to optimizing for the vocal minority, and it can lead to missing innovation opportunities that customers can't quite articulate. Let's look at an example of that in action. And so, you know, OkCupid is a company like many other companies that really uses user research. But one of the things that PMs can do over time is start to take shortcuts in terms of user research. At many companies, user research can become time-consuming or expensive. And so PMs look for ways that they can connect with customers in a much more real-time way. And one of the ways to do that is actually to look at what your customers are saying in online communities such as Reddit, and also talk to people internally on your team that are dogfooding your product, that are using their product themselves. The problem with this approach is that this approach tends to focus efforts on the power users. If someone is using your product enough that they're willing to talk about it in Reddit, they are by default one of your most engaged users. And they may give you feedback, but that feedback may be perfect for them, but not perfect for the majority of users that the product is trying to serve. The same is true for internal users. Internal users will have used the product for years. They will be the most savvy in what the product does and doesn't do. And so they're going to give you feedback that is skewed. And so one of the things that OkCupid had heard and had optimized for was people want to get as many messages as possible. Because when you get messages within a dating app, you have an opportunity to connect with someone, you have an opportunity to meet someone and to go out on a date. And so it makes sense that the more messages, the better, especially for these power users who are trying to get the most value from the product. But what ended up happening was that this optimization to try to get more and more messages to people resulted in a new user experience where some users would come into the product and just get inundated with 20 or 30 messages on their first day, which was a very off-putting experience because, you know, the last thing that you want to do is feel like you've sort of walked into a room and everyone is staring at you and wanting to interact with you. This is particularly challenging for female users where that attention can come across as off-putting and somewhat toxic. And so what OkCupid needed to do was actually step away from the feedback that they were getting through the channels that they were using and think intuitively about what is the best first-time user experience. And the best first-time user experience is not the most messages. It's a handful of high quality messages that get you into conversations with people that you really want to meet. And so they made a decision which actually went against what the analytics were saying, which was that more messages equals more retention, what the users were saying, which is we want more messages. And they decided to pull back on the number of messages that new users would get. And as a result, they created an intuitively better product, which is the right decision for both the users and the right decision for the company. And so we've taken a look at these three different pillars of product decision making, and we've taken a look at some of the things that happen when they're done well. We've taken a look at some of the things that happen when done poorly. So intuition, when done well, leads to valuable insights that can have a disruptive impact and can lead to years of significant growth. Done poorly, intuition leads to misguided investments and big misses. Analytics, when done well, enables products to reach their maximum potential. But analytics done poorly results in incrementality, diminishing returns, and eventual irrelevance. There's a lot of companies who have gotten incredibly good at analytical-based growth and have gotten to a point where they're hitting those diminishing returns, and other companies have come in with a disruptive insight and really displaced them within the market. And then lastly, feedback leads to deep and accurate understanding of customer needs and a better, more valuable product. But an over-reliance on feedback can lead you to focus on the vocal minority and can lead you to missed opportunities that customers can't see. In actuality, when you're using all of these different pillars of product decision-making together, they reinforce each other. So good intuition helps synthesize analytics and feedback into valuable insights. Good analytics supports intuitive conclusions and helps validate research findings at scale. And good research improves a company's intuition and deepens understanding of analytics. And so the benefit of using all three of these pillars of decision-making isn't just that they lead to more balanced decisions, but that they are self-reinforcing and they lead to better product decisions, not just overall, but they lead to better research, better analytics, better intuition. And so ultimately, a product manager's job is to make decisions. The quality of your decisions are going to impact the quality of your product. The quality of your product is going to impact the value that you're creating for your customers and the value that you're creating for your company. The best way to make the best decisions is to draw from the three pillars of product decision making and draw from that in a balanced way so that you're making decisions that are both intuitive, that are underpinned by great analytical insights, and that are informed by customer research. So happy to take any questions that people have about the three pillars of product decision-making or other things that people have questions about.
Yeah. So Ravi, that was quite interesting. I've made so many notes myself, for myself actually. So moving on to the questions, we actually received like 300 odd questions during the registrations.
Oh, great.
And we kind of like cut them down to a few ones, and there are some live questions still coming in. So going to the first one, Ravi, you mentioned about the three focus areas for good decision making, which is intuition, analytics, and feedback. And the end goal is eventually, you know, to crack all of them together to some extent. But which ones do you think that the product managers which you have worked with struggle with? And what would you recommend them, like how to go about upskilling them in that specific domain?
I think it's interesting. I think it varies by company. A lot of companies focus a lot on analytics. And so they get into this mode of running experiments and then looking at the results of the experiment, then shipping the thing that won, and just doing that over and over again. And when you do that, you're sort of treating your customers as if they exist in a petri dish and you're sort of poking them with things. And a lot of times I've seen the quality of experiments actually go down. You sort of run an experiment that intuitively you think, there's no way customers are going to want this. And then you run it and it fails. Or even worse, you run it and you find that it succeeds, but it succeeds probably because it wasn't statistically significant or there was some, issue, or even sometimes, perfectly valid experiments succeed because they're the right thing for that particular metric, but not the right thing for users. Making buttons bigger and bigger and making buttons flashy. That's a great example of you can get more clicks on the button, but you do that over and over again and your product ends up looking like Las Vegas where you just have lights sort of blinking at users. And then somebody comes along with a beautifully designed, streamlined product and all of a sudden they take all your users away. So that's, I think, the mode of decision-making that's really in fashion right now and is the most common failure mode for product managers. And ultimately you can go so much further by just taking a step back from the analytics and then looking at intuitively, does this make sense? And that's an easy process. The second thing is when you pair customer research and usability studies and focus groups with analytics, that's like a superpower. You instantly make your analytical insight a lot deeper because you're not just trying to look at the numbers and understand what's happening. You actually get to a causal understanding of why certain things are happening.
Interesting. That's nice. Thanks, Ravi. I think that was really insightful. My question was a little longer. I think we heard like a lot of examples from your deck. Going a little personal into your journey, you worked across Xbox, you worked with Tinder, you worked with Facebook, you worked with TripAdvisor. A lot of it on the consumer side, like each of them having millions and now billions of users. So I'm pretty sure the product decision frameworks that you would have used across these might have been a little different given the product cultures. Could you share some of these examples across your journeys? How was your role at each of these firms? Any interesting examples from your personal journey as well?
I think what's interesting is, so each of the product decision-making cultures at those companies were different. Facebook, for example, is a highly analytical culture, particularly within the growth teams. But one of the things people don't realize about Facebook is it has one of the largest user research teams in the industry. There's hundreds of PhDs that have done studies in user research. They're running user research every week. There's usability labs within the Facebook headquarters. They're running research globally. And so there's this constant influx of information about users. And so Facebook, I think, has done a really good job of being analytical, but also not losing sight of the fact that conversations with users can be really valuable. And so the combination of those things, I think, has given Facebook a pretty good intuition about what's going to work and what's not going to work. Ultimately, analytics rule at Facebook. Like, you're not going to roll something out, and if it's if you can't see analytically that it's working, people aren't just going to go with it because intuitively they feel it's the right thing, which I think is probably different than Apple, where intuitively they're designing for the right thing, and they'll go with that even if the analytics show that it's not as optimal from a numbers perspective. Tinder was a much more intuition-driven company. The initial product market fit for Tinder was driven by intuition, and the company has driven a lot of its product development based on intuition and is adding in deeper capabilities around analytics and user research. Of the three modes of decision making, the one I find that is most often underutilized is research. And I think this happens because people think about user research as being really heavyweight. People often are working with user research companies that cost a lot of money and are slow. And they think about, okay, we're going to do our quarterly user research right now, and we'll maybe, do like 3 or 4 user studies in a year. But in reality, user research is just a fancy way of saying, I'm going to talk to customers. And you could talk to someone in an Uber ride. You can talk to someone that you meet on the street and get as valuable insight often as having like a formalized study. It's not going to be as statistically significant, but sometimes it doesn't need to be to help you understand what's happening. And so startups have no user research budget. They also have no data. All they have is their intuition and the ability to talk to their early customers. And that's often why startups can disrupt larger companies, is because they're much closer to the customers than big companies. And so I think regardless of whether you're at a big company or a smaller company, keeping that relationship close with the customer and nurturing that relationship is really important. And it doesn't have to be expensive or time consuming.
Got it.
So,
yeah, I just have one follow-up. I think I was going through a lot of these questions. There was a bunch of them around Tinder, but since we were talking about user research and the product managers on your team at Tinder specifically, this is from one of the questions, how often did they go out and find dates or matches on Tinder?
It really depended. Like, I've been happily married for a long time, so I did not go out and find dates on Tinder. It really depends. I think that's another thing that's interesting specifically at Tinder, and then more broadly, is oftentimes early product managers at a company are the customers for the product. But then over time, as they age up, this is particularly true for consumer companies, they become less and less the target market. So at Tinder early on, a lot of the PMs were using Tinder actively to find dates. And now, it's not the case that as many people are using Tinder actively. And so I think there's a couple of things that are really important there. One is to talk to the people who are, because oftentimes the people who are actively using the product, especially people outside of the product org who aren't thinking about the product every day, can have the same sort of deep insights that a user might have, and they're readily accessible. But also to understand that they represent a biased user because they're in the building, they want to see the product succeed, they're probably going to be the most knowledgeable about the product. So one is to keep those conversations going. Two is to make sure that you're talking to customers outside the building as well. Oftentimes, early startups and early founders do rely on intuition because they are their own customer. But over time, they become less their own customer, and then they need to start relying on analytics and feedback. And so what's interesting, I think, about these three pillars is the importance of each of them can change over time. And people can get comfortable using one over and over again because it's been successful for them, but it's probably been successful for them because of that specific time in the product and the specific context that they had. And it may not be the thing that's successful for them years down the road.
Got it. Thanks so much. Fair point.
So moving from this point, so Ravi, we generally see that time is a major factor in making this whole decision making process, and most of the times PMs have to make a lot of decisions on the fly and quite regularly. So what would you recommend to PMs to think about the speed of decision making process, and while taking the decisions, what should be the thought process in context of the second and the third order consequences of those decisions? Yeah,
the company.
I think there's a couple of things to keep in mind. The first one is that the cost of making a bad decision grows significantly, almost exponentially, based on where you are in the product process. So early on, you may say it's going to be really painful for me to talk to customers or me to do 20 reports. And so I'm just going to make the decision. But if it's the wrong decision, you go and you build a product and you ship that product, it's become much more costly. And so it's really important, I think, for people to front load the time that they're spending to get to the right decision and be very confident that they're aiming at the right thing before they decide to shoot in a particular direction. That's not human nature. The human nature is to make the decision, build something, see if it works or not. But the problem then is you get into a mode where you're throwing spaghetti against the wall and some of it sticks, some of it doesn't. And if you have a low hit rate on the products that you're shipping, then that's something that becomes an incredible headwind to progress at the company. Whereas you can actually increase your hit rate on features that you ship significantly by taking the time that you're spending on building and put that time into decision making. So the important thing is not making fast decisions. The important thing is making the right decision and then quickly executing against that right decision. So that's the first thing. So don't rush the decision if you can, because the cost of making the wrong decision is much higher than the cost of spending a little bit more time to make the right decision. The second thing is that when people think about speed, they naturally think about velocity. So how do we get more done? I think important components to speed, and maybe even the more important component to speed, is not velocity, but latency. So when you're talking about moving more quickly, you both want to increase the velocity of work that you're doing, but you also want to decrease the latency between the time that I have an insight, or the time that I have a hypothesis, and the time that I have an insight from that hypothesis. And if that latency between those two is on the order of days or weeks, you'll be able to learn much faster, and that faster learning will result in better decisions. So my advice for people is not to try to do more, but try to decrease that latency between the time when you've come up with an idea and the time when you're actually getting the results from the idea. And even if you're doing less in that case, that will often be faster for you to get to the right decision to build more valuable products than if you were to just get more feature work done.
Got it. I got another interesting one for you. I think throughout your deck, a bunch of great examples, right from Apple to Snapchat. One that I really liked was the Airbnb 11-step aha moment one. So while you worked at, Facebook, Tinder, Xbox, any of these companies, did you ever make any similar thing for products that you worked on, or any interesting thing that you could share? How did you look at, any of the products that you worked on from this lens?
From the aha moment.
Yep.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting aha moments for me was at Facebook. This was like 2018 timeframe. We were trying to understand how teens use video, and where they were going to watch video and how they communicated with video. The goal was to really better position Facebook as a platform where people would go to find and share video that was valuable to them. Because what we were seeing is that teens were spending more time on YouTube, they were spending more time on Instagram, they were spending time on places like Twitch. And the thing that we heard over and over again from people during the course of the conversations that we were having, in particular, we were trying to study Musical.ly and where that might go. The things that we heard over and over again from people was that sharing video was an important component of conversation. So sharing video was almost like sending a gift. And the thing that we heard specifically about Musical.ly was that Musical.ly wasn't as good as Vine. Like the videos on Musical.ly were too music oriented. They were cringy at times. And what they wanted was really short, funny clips that they could send to someone to make them laugh. Because making someone laugh is something valuable you can do for them socially. And so in 2018, this was a year or so after Vine had already shut down, a lot of teens were still talking about watching Vines on YouTube and sending Vine compilations to their friends via YouTube. And so we had this interesting insight, which was that short humor-based video was the thing that teens really wanted. We tried, we got to a point where we started to productize ideas around that, but that was also around the same time that TikTok came to the same insight. And so they took the things that Musical.ly was doing and they incorporated that. They took the same mechanics and they really changed the content from music-based content to humor-based content. And as a result, they hit this, this explosive growth. And so TikTok became the thing that replaced Vine because they understood much better what customers wanted from video than anybody else in the space. And I think it's a really good example of how you can look at all the metrics in the world, but a handful of conversations can uncover something that's vitally important and that can lead to like the future of where things are going more so than just pouring over data can. Because if we looked at data at the time, it would tell us completely different things than what teens were telling us, which is that, hey, we missed Vine. And so, that was the insight that, really, I think led to TikTok becoming such an explosive, or leading to TikTok's really explosive growth.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that that insight they got from Vine and actually built out that. I think that was something that really worked for them. Yep.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
So, Ravi, we have a very interesting question coming on the live chat from Amia. So she's saying that how do you handle a situation where there is conflicting result between the three pillars? So intuition is saying something else and analytics is saying something else. And are there any particular examples that you can share that you have faced, and what was your thought process during that?
Yeah, I think there's, I think a number of examples. I'm trying to think of a really good one. I think the OkCupid example that I shared is a really good example of where intuition was at odds with analytics. And this, I think, illustrates a more common pattern within the tech industry right now. There are always things that you can do to move metrics. And those things, over time, they become more and more obvious about how much you push things, how many notifications you're sending, how interruptive your modals are, how big your buttons are. All of those things analytically can get you to where you think that you want to go. But if you take that to the logical conclusion, you end up with a product that slowly becomes less and less useful for people, becomes a kitchen sink product, becomes a product that's interruptive and annoying. And then someone else can come in with something that intuitively is a lot better. The challenge is that if you were to streamline your product, get rid of those CTAs, do a much better job of solving the problem for a customer, you probably will go down on the metric that you've been optimizing for the past couple of years. And so oftentimes intuitively where you think you should go is at odds with analytically where the analytics say you should go. And the way to really resolve that for me over and over again I've seen is to do the right thing for the customer. if you solve for the customer, it might be that in the short term, you need to take an analytics hit, but in the long term, you'll have a much more valuable business. If you don't solve for the customer, then over time that will wear on the customer, and eventually they'll leave. And they'll leave in a way that is not as detectable via analytics. It'll just feel like a constant headwind to growth. Actually, a really good example of this I can share is recently I watched a movie on Amazon using Amazon Video. I didn't really notice anything with the movie. It wasn't the best streaming in the world, but it was a perfectly fine experience. And a day later, I got an email from Amazon and said, we've automatically refunded you for this movie because the streaming quality did not meet the standard that we want for you. And this was an example of they had I was not going to file for a refund. They had no reason to give up that revenue. But by sending me that message, it told me that Amazon's on my side and they have an even higher bar than I have for the quality of the services that they want to deliver. And I think Amazon is actually one of the best examples of a company that's customer obsessed, and they will do everything possible to do the right thing by the customer, even when that means lower analytics, and even when it means lower revenue potentially. Another good example with Amazon is Amazon doesn't send abandoned cart emails. Like, that's a best practice in the industry. You can get more conversion from abandoned cart emails, and they can increase their revenue significantly. But I've never gotten one from them. They're kind of annoying. They've only recently started using email at all, and they're using it primarily to make recommendations. So these are examples where if you leave certain optimizations on the table, you can drive a better customer experience. And by doing that, the right thing from the customer, you're going to create a long-term, more valuable company. By doing the wrong thing for the customer, your stock price might go up, your metrics might go up, you might get a promotion. So it can be very lucrative, but over time, you'll find that companies get disrupted.
Awesome. Ravi, I know we've just overshot time, so we'll try picking up top 3 questions. I think one is our usual set, one around hiring that I saw, and one more interesting question. Just giving you a heads up if that is fine.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Awesome. So the next one is something around hiring. I think a lot of our audience today is mid-senior, senior PMs. You worked across a lot of these, which we call dream companies. So any tips or tricks for people who either want to break in or move ahead up on their career? How do you view anything that you can share from your journey, how people should look at it? And just one added thing, do you have any breaking factors when you are trying or when you are hiring? Is there something, 1 or 2 qualities that you hire for which is like a must have in a product manager?
Yeah, that sounds good. So to the first, I think there's kind of 3 questions there. The first one is how to get hired at some of these big companies. I actually have on my blog a post. It's called An Insider's Guide to the Facebook Interview Process.
Awesome.
And it's not just useful for Facebook, it's also useful for some of the other big tech companies. Facebook has an incredibly thoughtful approach to hiring product managers that focuses on 3 different competencies. The first one is product sense. The second one is ability to execute. And the third one is leadership and drive. And so I talk about in that post what Facebook in particular is looking for, what some common questions are, why they look for those things, and why they approach the interview in the way that they do. And this will, I think, not only help you prepare for the Facebook interview, but also help you prepare for other big tech interviews. I think that combination of 3 things is pretty common across companies. I also have on my blog a product competency toolkit that I've used, which defines the 12 competencies that I look for in product managers. I've organized those into 4 different areas. So the first one is around, and it's very similar to Facebook's approach. The first one is product execution. The second one is customer insight. The third one is product strategy. And the fourth one is influencing people. And so collectively, those are the 4 things that I look for for a product manager. And so, that's something that through the interview process, you want to suss out. If there's one thing I look for more than anything else that kind of cuts across all of those 4, it's the ability to learn. I think product management is an interesting role in that it's very different from company to company. The tech industry is changing. What customers want is changing. Technology is changing. And so the job that you're doing today is going to be different than the job that you're doing 3 or 4 years from now. And so the ability to be an athlete, the ability to learn quickly, to adapt, to do lots of different things in lots of different roles is the thing I look for more than anything else. And so if you combine the ability to learn with a good sensibility about product, those I think are the fundamental ingredients of a great product manager. And I think what's interesting about those is those are not things that you need a deep education in. And so I think anybody who wants to move into product management can do that. I think anybody who wants to be successful in product management can do that. It's not like becoming a doctor where you need to have credentials. The really important things are, having a learning mindset, and then having a good sensibility about what makes a great product for a customer. I think to the last question of how to grow as quickly as possible within an organization, the thing that you really want to do, regardless of what the organization is telling you, is think about how do I drive business impact? Because if you drive impact for the business, you create value for the company, that is going to mean that you stand out from the crowd, and are someone that people look to drive results. So important to shift the mindset from shipping features, like just doing the job, writing specs, shipping features, doing UX designs, doing product reviews, doing presentations is not nearly as important as delivering impact. So the person that generates a 2% or 5% revenue win, and is shown that they've actually contributed positively to revenue, regardless of what that process looked like, will be someone that the company really grows to count on. The person who is great at the process, great at sort of the elements of product, but isn't driving the business impact, you may get credit for those things, you may not get credit for those things. And so that's going to be a more sort of random growth process. And it really depends on to the extent to which your manager recognizes the things that you're doing really well. And so ultimately you want to do both. You want to be both great at the process as well as generate results. But if you're going to focus on one thing, it's the results that I think ultimately get rewarded over the long term.
Got a fair point too.
Yeah. So Ravi, in the interest of time, so we have a bunch of PM managers and leaders have joined us today. I see it on the participant chat section. So a very common question that we have received is that how do you go about coaching PMs so that they are able to take great decisions within this framework or overall for the organization? And I'm sort of clubbing this question with another interesting question I have from Ashish Chatterjee on the chat, that how do you create a culture where the three pillars are more balanced: intuition, analytics, and feedback? These are more balanced as a culture. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the coaching is when I coach PMs that are on my team, I take a very individualized approach, where I look at, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Where is that particular person spiky? So where are their skills, their tendencies, their biases mapped to, and their strengths mapped to things that will help solve that problem? And what are, and for the areas where they don't have strengths, can I complement them with people that bring those strengths to the table, or are those things that they need to focus on as an area of improvement? And so, oftentimes, one of the things that I believe very strongly is that really good PMs are spiky. They'll have strengths in certain areas, and the best thing that you can do as a manager is help them reinforce those strengths and then complement them with people that make that are complementary to those strengths and make the team really balanced. So people should be spiky and teams should be balanced, I think, is an important rule of thumb. The product management role is so broad that it's impossible to be great in everything that it demands. And when you try to get people to just focus on kind of filling gaps and not reinforcing strengths, you end up with well-rounded PMs, but you don't end up with PMs that are really spiky in certain areas and excel in certain areas. And so increasingly, I think product management is actually starting to bifurcate into multiple different types of product roles, growth roles, innovation roles, infrastructure roles. And so, I think part of being successful as a PM is understanding where you naturally shine and moving into those roles where you naturally do really well. There's certain PMs that don't want to do a lot of research and they want to be really analytical. And so, growth teams make a lot of sense for them, as long as they're not doing that to the point where they're no longer making good decisions. And so I think that goes to the second question, which is, creating a culture of balance in terms of decision making. I think it draws a lot from what is that particular organization trying to do, and what's the right way to accomplish that. A growth team is naturally going to have more of a scientific mindset, more of an analytical mindset. If they do that to the exception of the other modes of decision making, they'll end up becoming incremental, or they'll end up with a lower hit rate. And so, the balance can go a long way towards reinforcing that strength around analytical decision making. A team that's that's being really innovative and is thinking about developing products and finding new sources of product market fit, they're going to have to rely more on intuition and customer research. And so a lot of the balance comes from understanding what the team is trying to accomplish and making sure that you're striking the right balance based on that purpose.
Got it. Yeah. I think thanks so much for sharing that in detail. I think that's definitely going to help a lot of them on this call. For the interest of time, we have this usual set that we found like great feedback on. So we'd like to jump right in. We have a couple of more questions, Ravi. So probably after this session, we'll share them with you. I think there are still 23 of them. We'll share them with you, and in case you can cover it on your blog or sometime on Twitter, I think that would be great. So moving on to the fun part of it. This is our usual 3x3 rapid fire. So the first one is, I'm pretty sure you'll be interacting with a lot of early stage startups who are reaching out to you for feedback. So in the Valley or across, what are 3 early stage startups that you're really excited about right now?
Yeah, so 3 startups I'm excited about. One is a company I'm working with called Sesame, which is building a direct-to-patient marketplace for healthcare. What they're really trying to do is solve for some of the challenges within the American healthcare system, specifically related to health insurance, and allow people to get healthcare directly from health providers, which sounds like a very simple thing to do, but is not how the American healthcare system works. And they're taking a marketplace approach to that and solving a need, which I think is increasingly important. There's now 5 million people that are newly uninsured and they can't afford insurance, but they can't not afford healthcare. And so by enabling doctors to provide their services directly to patients at a low price, they're able to actually get people the care they need without having to have this very expensive blanket of health insurance. So I'm really excited about that because I think it's both an important thing impactfully right now. And it's an interesting way of helping to solve the problem in the healthcare industries in the US. Second company that I'm really excited about is a newly launched company called Keyring. I know the founder really well. He's someone who's been thinking really deeply about where media and entertainment is going. And he's developed, so a lot of people will share passwords with each other for different streaming services, for Netflix and Disney and things of that sort. And so what he's doing is creating a formalized way to share passwords. So essentially what he's trying to do is create the cable bundle for Generation Z and enable people to access a bundle of streaming services at a much more affordable price than is currently available today, which I think is a really interesting strategy, especially given where things are going. And then the third startup I'm really interested in is a company called Realtime, founded by someone named Vernon Coleman. He and his co-founder, Kevin, they were creating a platform for people to be able to meet in real life. And when COVID hit, that idea became really challenging, and so they've taken that same DNA of in real life events and created an interesting platform for people to meet and talk online that feels very different than the rest of the video solutions that are out there today. And I think they're solving a really meaningful problem in terms of how people connect via video that's particularly relevant given everything happening in the world today.
Absolutely, and I think we'd love to check those out as well. Very interesting stuff. Move on to the next one. In the recent past, are there any books or resources that you think might be really interesting for our audience? So any top three resources that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think the number one book I recommend for product managers is Inspired by Marty Kagan. I just think it's like the one book that really covers product management in as comprehensive a way as possible. And for anyone looking to get into product management or early on in their product management career, I recommend that. He has a new book called Empowered, which is for product leaders. I haven't read it yet, but I think if it's anything like the first book, it'll be a really great resource. Other book I really recommend for people that I love is Competing Against Luck by Clayton Christensen, which talks about jobs to be done. And it's basically an antidote to his past books. So his past books have talked about how companies get disrupted, and Competing Against Luck talks about how companies can make sure they're not getting disrupted and really innovate by putting customers first. And all of his books are fantastic. This one in particular resonated with me because it's got such a great distillation of the jobs to be done framework. And then I think a source of content that I keep going back to over and over again is Stratechery by Ben Thompson. He's also got a podcast called Exponent. And just on a routine basis, he's doing these incredibly thoughtful, sharp breakdowns of what's happening strategically within tech. And I think just consuming that content makes you a smarter thinker about where things are going and how to find opportunities within the tech industry.
Yeah, I think, we love these resources too. So thanks for sharing. Last one, but most important in our thing is 3 folks who you think you'd like to give a shout out to, who probably, inspired you, you worked with, or, your mentors or anyone in general, but 3 folks that you think we could probably learn a lot from.
Yeah. I think one of the people that's inspired me the most is Adam Medros, who is the head of product at TripAdvisor and is now the head of edX. He's the president of edX. He's just a fantastic product thinker, fantastic business thinker. He's someone that it's been a mentor of mine and inspired me. Other folks, I think I'm trying to think of people that are good to follow on Twitter. And I think another one is, of course, Brian, who's the CEO of Reforge. He's done just a fantastic job of taking all of the knowledge that's out there in the world, including the latest knowledge, and distilling it into really easy to consume content, and really helping people level up, both through Reforge as well as just through the content that's really available on his site and the Reforge site. If there's, he's definitely in the list of like kind of top three people that I would follow. And then I think, someone else who's really great. There's a lot of really good writers on Substack now. Lenny Rachitsky has done a great job of sharing really thoughtful long form essays about interesting topics within marketplaces, growing new startups. And I always feel smarter, reading one of his posts. So those are 3 people I recommend following and keeping up to speed with.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing the name. I think, these are definitely, folks that are doing a great thing. If you ask me as well, I think, Reforge, even the blog, even without attending a course, I think just the blog is a great content. Lenny's, even the free articles are great. I think paid is even better, but yeah, I think I concur with you for sure.
Absolutely. And related to that, also involved with Reforge is Andrew Chen. So if you go to Brian's blog, you go to Andrew's blog, there's everything you possibly want to learn about growth between those two resources.
Absolutely agree. With that, we come to the end of the rapid fire. One thing that we like to end with is, it's a series called If You Knew Then What You Know Now. So what would you share with a younger Ravi, maybe 10, 15 years back?
I think the biggest thing, this may not be as practical, but the biggest thing that I've learned is, I think 10 or 15 years ago, I was very idealistic about technology. I think, the industry was very idealistic about technology. I think there was this idea that technology was de facto good. It was there's a very egalitarian approach to technology. I think today we're in a world where, we know that's not true, that technology is not de facto good, that there's moral decisions baked in the products that we're creating, that they can have really profoundly positive impact on people. They can also have profoundly negative impact on people. So the thing I would tell myself 10 or 15 years ago, which I think is really important for all of us as product builders to think about, is be really thoughtful about creating technology that is great for your customers, not just because you're trying to build a business around it, but also does the right thing by your customers and creates a world that we all want. It's very easy with these products, especially with gamification and all the things that we can do to manipulate behavior to create something that's bad for people. And you could even create a great business that way. But it's much more, I think, meaningful, much more impactful, both for the world and as an entrepreneur and a product builder, to build things that are really empathetic to the customers that you're building for, and solve the problems that they have in a really positive way. So that's the thing I would tell myself 10 or 15 years ago. I think is really important moving forward to take that mindset.
Absolutely. I think the first thing that comes to my mind when I hear that is what Chamath keeps saying, right? Like Chamath also keeps talking a lot about this. So yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Absolutely.
That.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that probably brings us to the close of this. So to end this, I think Ravi, I think it was a great time chatting with you. We learned a lot from the deck, from the questions that Parth and me put together, from what the audience asked us, as well as your journey that you shared through these examples. So thank you so much for these insights. Um, Anything that you'd like to share as closing thoughts, or anything that you'd like to plug? Anything that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, thank you to everyone for attending. Great conversation, great questions. I know we only got to a small fraction of the questions. Feel free to reach out to me. If my contact info is on my blog, so feel free to reach out to me directly via email or Twitter or LinkedIn. Would love to keep the conversation going. And lots of luck to everyone. I think the most exciting time for the tech industry is yet to come. Despite all the progress that we've made, I think we're going to make even more over the next 5 years, and excited for everyone here to be part of building that.
Thanks a ton, Ravi. Guys,
Lot,
just
Ravi.
thanks, Parth. Just a small note. Ravi is, like you mentioned earlier, joined as an EIR to Reforge. Reforge has a great series going on. They've closed application, but some of y'all did reach out to us, and I think we requested Ravi in the beginning. So in case some of y'all are still, looking to pursue it but missed the spot, feel free to write to him. And I think on a basis, just mention TPF and what you'd like to learn from this. So I think he's leading the product strategy bit there, right? That is something that you were going to be leading at EIR, right? As an EIR at Reforge, right?
Yeah, so I'll be leading the product strategy course, and then I think there's 5 or 6 other courses right now. There's the growth series, which is like a foundational growth course, engagement and retention, monetization, advanced growth strategy, and then 2 new courses for this fall, marketing strategy, which is focused on helping marketing leaders level up from marketing managers into marketing leaders, and then product strategy, which is equivalently focused on helping product managers level up into product leaders.
Awesome. Yep. So guys, do definitely reach out to Ravi, and I think we've shared his Twitter handle, so definitely follow him. And if you guys like the session, feel free to give him a shout out. Any feedback, feel free to write to us. With that, just closing the session. Thanks once again, Ravi. Thanks so much for joining us, guys. And any feedback, feel free to reach out to us. Bunch of initiatives. So launch a new website, check it out. Volunteer driven. So reach out to us anytime. And anything that you like us to do, any speakers you like us to invite. 100 PMs is a new initiative we launched. We have Learn PM with me. So any of these initiatives that you find interesting or you like us to do, feel free to reach out to us. Yep. And
thank you so much for having me. It was such a good conversation.
Thank you so much, Ravi.
Same here, Ravi. Thank you so much. Day. And thanks so much, guys. Stay safe wherever you are, and we'll see you next weekend.
Bye.
See you.